Hello, role-playing people! Because multiple comments regarding the same subject have piled up, and because I know this is a recurring question on the White Wolf RPG subreddit, in this episode I'm going to present you a little Demon the Fallen reader's guide, so you know exactly what kind of information can be found in which book, and you can decide for yourself if a certain supplement is useful to you. Without further ado, let's get right to it. Probably the most useful book when it comes to expanded, corrected, and even new mechanics, a supplement that is useful for both players and storytellers alike, is the Player's Guide. This one starts you off with details regarding what the Fallen are, like an anatomy of angels, if you will, forms and names. It invites you to consider and answer a few questions when creating a character, like their role in the Fiat Lux moment of creation, where they were during the Age of Wrath and how they felt then, how they feel now about the Giver, Lucifer, humanity, and so on. Then it shares more details about the act of possessing a human host and the phases a fallen goes through after the possession: distortion, dissociation, reconstruction, and rebirth, while immediately following up with an expanded legacy background, which aims to help players understand how to integrate memory and remembrance into the game, both narratively and mechanically. After that, all backgrounds are taken and explained in detail, one by one, with emphasis on what a player can do to obtain or increase a certain background, but also how and when storytellers can decrease or remove certain backgrounds. Allies get hurt, contacts are getting too hot, too visible and must lay low, that kind of thing. It's a very useful tool for really playing up the backgrounds your players chose, making them integral part of the story, but it also gives suggestions on how these backgrounds can come into conflict with one another, creating a bit of drama, which is something you rarely see a game do, creating conflict between two positive traits on a character's sheet. Absolutely amazing. Then the books describe the 3 virtues which are found on the sheet and shares a few more example behaviors of various combinations, like how would a low conscience, high conviction, low courage character behave? What about a high conscience, low conviction, high courage protagonist? And immediately, this is followed up by a presentation of virtues in relation to the houses and factions, which house or faction usually shows which combination, and so on, just so you can get started with this a bit easier. Very useful stuff. Oh, and it gets better. Then we get mechanics for teaching and learning from one character to another. We're told about resonances, which is a mechanic you also find in Mage, though it works a little different here. But I really like having the resonance mechanic in Demon too. In short, the idea is that certain objects and items, places, beings, philosophies, and feelings have a certain resonance which can enhance the evocations of the fallen. So the game rewards you for casting the right thing in the appropriate circumstance, choosing the best time and place, but also by surrounding yourself in things that resonate with said evocation. This is why slayers often step into the low umbra from a graveyard or a funeral parlor. This is why a malefactor who maintains a collection of maps and such might find their use of lore of paths facilitated, as will those who actually open a workshop and they physically labor on an object before resorting to their superpowers, right? Enhancing that object. This is why a devourer of the wild works best in the wild, not in a mall. Resonance is a really nice mechanic which invites the player to make a little ritual out of using a lore and keep things interesting, creative, and narrative. So I love it. Then we get an entire chapter on merits and flaws, the merits and flaws which were excluded from the core rulebook, sadly. And this is followed by the chapter on customizing apocalyptic forms, with seemingly endless pages and lists of new form features, along with descriptions of the initial roles of the standard apocalyptic forms. So with this supplement, Demon goes, yeah, well, we know these Celestials still maintain a semblance of their original forms, but they didn't just have 27 forms and that's it. No, their forms were basically adaptations to their labor, and because some of them worked on very diverse tasks with other houses they learned things from, yeah, their forms are varied and players can make their own. We are also told how forms can change as a result of different events, for example, consuming other fallen and things like that. After this one, we get one chapter which expands the crafting mechanics of Demon the Fallen, with special emphasis on the lore of the Forge, which allows you to create very impressive relics. And the last chapter is dedicated to rituals, a mechanic which isn't even mentioned in the core rulebook and which allows you to blend together multiple evocation paths and create a powerful effect. Anything from health potions to summoning elementals of all types, anchoring the souls of the dead to plants or flowers, or parting the sea. I don't even know. The list just goes on, and the rituals are neatly organized by house. The house which is most likely to have access or remember such a rite. So yeah, the player's guide is chock full of useful stuff which elevates not only the mechanics, the very act of interacting with the game world, but also inspires storytellers to spin amazing stories which might revolve around an item, a ritual, a character, a memory, a resonance, an evocation, whatever. The only problem with this book is it doesn't contain much lore, which brings us to number 2, Houses of the Fallen. Each chapter of this book is dedicated to one of the houses, starting with devils and ending with slayers, and each presents the following. The house's role in creation, not from an outsider perspective, but from their own, their role during the war and all the horrible things they did, signature characters, both from the past and the present, current prominent members of the house, relics and lost rituals, which include more rituals similar to the ones in the player's guide, but they also include these secret little bonus abilities which tie in all the way back to a house's role in creation and which are still available to its members today. For instance, even before the fall, malefactors had a secret means of communication which implied encoding messages into stones and crystals on a resonance level in a way that the message to be passed on was neither written nor verbal and could only be deciphered by those who knew this secret tongue. They called this language stone speech and used it alongside the official one. Now, devils are one of the only houses who remember the first tongue of humanity, which is distinct from the Enochian, or the one language spoken by the fallen. These are just 2 examples, both of linguistic nature, but each house is done justice by receiving its own history, relics, and rituals and special bonuses. The chapters also present us with quick character creation suggestions, explaining what having a certain lore as your primary lore implies, explaining why it's a good idea to prioritize certain attributes and abilities based on your choice of house, and even providing us with some general concepts, some concept templates, if you will. I really love the fact that each house has conflicting memories and historical accounts of creation and the war compared to the other houses, because this contributes to the feeling of confusion and doubt of an elusive past that might not really be how you remember it, and maybe this elevates the tensions between player characters when they realize their house memories are quite different, and their versions of events only line up broadly, but this also encourages teamwork and discussion if they are ever to figure out what is most likely to have happened during their celestial pasts. The third book on my list of recommendations is The Storyteller's Companion, which I frequently refer to as that one book which makes your game run itself. Why does it do that? Because it details the factions, their canonical members, their strengths and weaknesses in such a way that it creates a setting you can use regardless of location. No matter where your story takes place, the leaders of these houses or their underlings might invoke and enlist the player character's assistance, which is fantastic. But I am getting ahead of myself. So the first chapter is about the Earthbound, and by that we mean predominantly the 5 archdukes, giving us details on their activities after they were summoned from the pit, from ancient times, and all the way to the time of Emperor Constantine and beyond. The second chapter deals with factions, and besides the things I've already mentioned, what's great about this chapter is that it gives suggestions and creates a context for chronicles or stories you can run fairly easily without having to create an entire court or a large cast of characters. It's about as read and play as it can get. I think it really helps players understand the goals, but most importantly the means of these factions, and it even suggests future outcomes on a setting-wide level if one faction ascends to the heights of power, getting closer to achieving its final goal, or conversely goes into a decline, suffering a loss of prestige and power. The third chapter goes into some really nice lore regarding the spirit realm, and let me tell you, this ties in beautifully with the lore of Wraith, recontextualizing certain characters and to some degree demystifying their cryptic histories and destinies. This chapter also covers the current state of the underworld, which, in all honesty, isn't to my liking as written, and it isn't something I actively emphasize in my own games because I don't like this idea that the Deep Umbra is completely shattered by the Maelstrom and wraiths are already actively spilling into the world of the living, and even the Shadowlands are tattered and torn. I've noticed that using this setting tempts Slayer players to really overuse Wraith servants because they are so ever-present, while effectively destroying the setting of Wraith, rendering it incompatible with Demon. It destroys the necropoli or other interesting locations from the underworld, and my preference is to preserve the setting of Wraith even in Demon the Fallen because it creates very interesting scenarios and it encourages more exploration of a distinct realm, which is very nice. So beyond the interesting lore I found here, and it's really, really interesting, I haven't used this particular chapter much. The final chapter of this book translates the other supernaturals found in World of Darkness into Demon the Fallen systems, but again, personally, I'm familiar enough with the other games that I can just use their own systems when creating antagonists, so I don't need to do much translation. Well, with the exception of Werewolf, but what's interesting about this chapter is that it presents the relations between the Fallen and all these other supernaturals, how the encounters between them are most likely to go, why they would seek out or seek to destroy each other, which is very useful information. My conclusion for now is that The Storyteller's Companion is so full of story ideas, consequences of failure and rewards of success regarding factions, but also antagonists, and how to bring other supernaturals into the mix, that there's no way it won't inspire you to create a fat, juicy chronicle filled with everything it needs, or just help you quick start your chronicle with minimal preparation. Like I said, you read it and you run Demon. Easy as that. Fourth on my list of recommended reads is City of Angels, and the only reason I consider this book more important than the Earthbound supplement, which we will talk about soon, is because this one details the courts of the fallen. In the first chapters, we can read a history of the LA courts, how these were formed, and how the ministries were reinstated, but in later chapters we're given more details about eminence and status within and beyond a court, anything from Archduke to Fell Knight, the resources each rank has at its disposal, along with the responsibilities and duties that imposes, how these positions interact with a tyrant, how mortals and thralls serve the courts, what traditions and laws are in place, and we are also given more details about the Pentarchy, aka the 5 ministries. I've said it before and I will say it again, in my experience, this book is essential for any troupe who wants to enjoy a more political chronicle, with court intrigue, Machiavellian manipulation, or the uncovering of secrets the other fallen in the city hold. And it frustrates me quite a bit that this information wasn't included in the core book. This absolutely should have been included because courts add in a previously absent dimension of play. They create this space in which rival factions can, or should I say must, coexist without outright immediate hostility towards one another. The first time I read the core book, I got this feeling that the Fallen are scattered in somewhat of a post-apocalyptic world in which there are no rules and factions are the main form of societal organization. The courts not only give the Society of the Fallen more structure, inviting more interaction, but they effectively make the setting pre-apocalyptic, showing us that there is room for diplomacy in this community, that conflicts can be resolved using various means, not just physical aggression, that there are traditions and laws in place. In a mere 20 pages, I counted them, 20 pages, from 91 to 111, Demon goes from feeling like Fallen Angel Mad Max to Fallen Angel House of Cards. While I am very happy with this particular chapter of the book and the changes it makes to the core setting, it only lands on my 4th place of recommendations precisely because the rest of the book is just filled with ready-made characters, which are not particularly interesting. Some of them are really not interesting. The real value of this book is concentrated in this 20-page chapter, which could have easily been included in another supplement like the Player's Guide or the Storyteller's Companion. 5th on my list is the book Earthbound, and the reason this one is so low is not only because of its distasteful take on the history of the Archdukes, the infamous piece of lore which has put a lot of people off of Demon, but because this one is all about antagonists. Thus, it bears little weight when it comes to setting changes or player character creation options. I've already said, for me personally, this was a difficult and occasionally unpleasant read. But is this a bad book? Not at all. Earthbound brings in a lot of antagonist creation options. New natures, new mechanics, new lores, new items, systems which even players might use to some degree, and not only does it do this for the big baddies, but it puts the spotlight on their underlings too. Earthbound thralls also get new mechanics, backgrounds, items, and so on. Very interesting systems which enrich the game world and implicitly have an impact on the story, on the narration as well. Ever since I read this book, I cannot and will not create my Earthbound antagonists without it. Or their cults, of course. It really is that good and helps storytellers create very distinct monsters along with their whole cult, while taking into account a lot of aspects from general information like their role in creation, very general things, to very specific little details like the physical deformities on their thralls' bodies or their dependency on a certain substance. Things which player characters might notice or interact with from the very first sessions. Definitely a very useful supplement to have. So, these are the 5 books I recommend wholeheartedly and consider essential. But besides these, there's also Damned and Deceived, a book that deals with thralls and thrall character creation with a lot of examples and suggestions, but with very little mechanics, like the faith potential mechanic, which, though I take into account, is ultimately negligible. Or Saviors and Destroyers, which is all about hunters and exorcists, or just ordinary people who try to send the fallen back into the pit. Or the book Fear to Tread, which is a read and run chronicle book. Then there's also the novel trilogy, the collection of short stories, and of course these are all fun reads. They're fun. But do they make significant changes to the core book and the setting? Not really. So they're not essential for running or playing Demon. But then we arrive to one of my favorite books from this series, a title which, again, is not essential, but it makes for an amazing read. So much so that I even bought it as a physical copy. And the book I'm referring to is Days of Fire. As a text which also exists within the setting of Demon, it was supposedly written by Lucifer himself, and it chronicles celestial events, human choices which have changed everything, the birth of supernaturals in the world of darkness and their respective moments of degeneration, but then it follows that up with prophecy of the end of times and how each sign has already been made manifest or is manifesting right now. The book beautifully collects real-life events, historical events, and blends them with supernatural fiction, effectively illustrating how the signs reveal themselves in both the mortal world, air quotes, our world, and the world of supernaturals. While it is similar to the Book of Nod or Revelations of the Dark Mother, Days of Fire isn't addressed to vampires or Bahari cultists or any other kind of secret society. It's addressed to humanity as a whole, to each and every individual mortal who populates the world of darkness, reminding all who read it that the current state of the world is a result of human choice. Though it might not look like it with all these supernaturals preying on mortals in one way or another, though it might feel like ordinary mortals don't have agency, they don't have that much power over their world. But as the book obsessively repeats, from human choice came all that followed. The only beings in the world of darkness who can create anew are ordinary mortals, unbound by a single paradigm so strong that it forces the world to change in accordance with it, but loses all flexibility in the process, unburdened by regret so strong it keeps them anchored in the underworld, preventing them from reaching that destiny which is theirs alone, untainted by the embrace, which snuffs out their fragment of divinity and gives them onto eternal unlife. Days of Fire beautifully ties in the lores of almost all of the other World of Darkness games, getting them to work together in the context of this setting, so we can clearly see Demon the Fallen never really wanted to invalidate the other origin myths. This whole celestial creation story isn't here to say, oh no, this is the way it happened, it is the only way it happened because that's how we remember it, and we were there to see for ourselves. If you think otherwise, you're wrong. No. The Fallen, as in the characters themselves, might feel that way, but Demon as a game actually pays homage to the titles that came before it. And just as all the splats have done it before, to some degree, it recontextualizes pre-existing pieces of lore which migrate from one game to another, because you can find similar bits of lore in multiple games. And what this does, it gives us another point of view, another perspective, even when the event described is already known and found in other games as well. But something is always changed, because that perception is subjective. So something is either added in or removed or simply taken into a different direction. I'm ranting, but the point is, Days of Fire is an amazing book, and if I could turn it into an endless supply of granules or powder, I'd put it in my coffee every morning. That's how much I like it. Hopefully this reader's guide is of use to you and helps you find the information you need as quickly as it can. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.